Hi guys, today I'm going to talk about my practice routine, and I'm going to give you a few other general suggestions and advice that I would like to share based on my experience throughout the years as a professional racer. So first of all, when you arrive at a new track which you've never seen before, you've never driven on this track before, it's a good idea to walk up to the driver's stand, to get on the driver's stand and to try to get a feel for the track. Depending on the track size, the driver's stand position where you're going to be driving from can be very important or less important. The bigger the track size in general, the less important the position of the driver's stand. So if it's an outdoor track, like pretty big, if the track's not just in front of the driver's stand, if there's a bit of a gap between the driver's stand and the track, then the position is going to be less important. Basically, I'm going to take this track here as an example. As you can see, the track's pretty big, and the driver's stand's tall, and you have a pretty good overview of the track. And in this case, it doesn't really matter where you stand. It's not going to affect your visibility much, except for slight differences in the perception of the car. But this is something that you can get used to while driving. But yeah, it's not going to be a problem. It's not going to give you any big advantage or disadvantage. However, on smaller tracks, indoors especially, you may have problems with obstacles such as posts that can be in the middle of the track. For example, I'm going to show you an example again. This track here has posts in the middle. So depending on where you're standing on the driver's stand, it can be a good idea to figure out if these posts limit the visibility for any parts of the track from the driver's stand. So this track, in fact, is not too bad, but I've seen tracks where more posts in the middle of the track can be a problem. So figure out if there's any spots where you actually cannot see some corners, and decide if it can be a disadvantage for you to stand in those spots. So that's very, very important for indoor tracks especially. So I personally prefer to stand at one end of the driver's stand, either all the way to the right or all the way to the left. But this is just a personal preference that I have. I just feel more comfortable on one end, so I don't have too many drivers next to me or close to me. And I also sometimes I like to choose the less desirable spot, if that makes sense. You can see at big races people queue up for their race, a few races before their own race. They get in line to be able to get their spot, and I feel that sometimes it's not worth the effort. It's better to choose a spot that's a little less desirable, and that way I don't have to stress about getting my spot, and I don't have to lose time from working on my car to get up to the rostrum 3 races before, especially if you don't have a mechanic. And this can also help for open practice. That way you don't have to wait around to get that free spot. You can choose a spot that less people want, and you're more likely to get track time in open practice. So all these variables can be important, and you need to find your own preference. That's just how I'd like to do it. Another thing which you can keep in mind is that the part of the track where you can win or lose the most time normally is the high-speed section. So I generally try to stand near the sweeper so that I can see the sweeper better. There's also examples where, for example, if there's difficult chicane sections on the track, I'm going to use another example here. So this track right here is an indoor track with a pretty low driver's stand. Track's pretty small, and it's very close to the driver's stand. So here you have 2 difficult chicane sections. One in the middle, but towards the right side of the track, and one right in front of the driver's stand. So in this case, I feel that it's beneficial to stand more towards the left. That way you can see this difficult chicane section with the car driving towards you rather than driving just in front of you. So this, in my opinion, makes this section a lot easier to get right while driving. So you always gotta decide if there's any advantage or disadvantage to seeing the car better in those sections. But as I said, I prefer having a difficult chicane section with the car driving towards me rather than having it just in front of me. And again, that's a personal preference, but I think it's a good general advice as well. So before going to a new track, I always try to prepare my cars the best that I can at home. To set up everything, make sure the cars are maintained and good to go. If I haven't been to the track before, I try to use either my base setup for that surface and for that tire, or I try to use a setup from a team driver which has been to the track before, or a local driver that's using the same car. So either one of those, depending on the race and the situation, and also the amount of practice that's gonna happen before the race. So those are all important things to keep in mind. And as you know, there's no shortcuts when it comes to preparation. So it's important to show up well prepared and ready for practice. So getting used to the track and start to make changes. Before you actually get on the track, it can be a good idea to watch some cars going around, preferably some local fast guys or some top drivers or some of your teammates even, to see how they're driving the track. What are their driving lines? Where are there braking points? Are there any sections of the track which seem more difficult? Are there any sections or spots where the drivers tend to crash more? So in that case, you can learn from that and try to avoid making the same mistakes as they're making. So it's always good to watch other cars going around to figure out some stuff before you actually drive yourself. This can save you some time, and it can prevent you from making mistakes. So my first runs on the track, they're usually all about the driving. So it's about finding the right lines, finding the braking points, etc. If you're at a race or at a practice session where you have a lot of time and you don't need to rush into dialing in your car, then I would spend at least 2 or 3 runs even, just to drive the car without any changes, just to get used to the track and try to find some consistency. Because it's difficult to start changing the car before you can be consistent with your driving. So try to get a couple of runs in until you start to feel comfortable and until you start to find the right lines and a good feel for the track. So the first thing that I pay attention to normally is my electronic setting, and this isn't modified. But in stock, obviously, it's about the gear ratio and the end belt timing. But in modified, usually it's about the speedo setting. Does my car have enough top speed? Does it have enough boost? Is it too fast or is it too slow? Does the brake setting feel alright? Do I have enough brake? How's the drag brake? So usually those are things that I try to determine early on before I start changing the car itself. So usually I start with a basic electronic setting from a similar track or from one of my teammates, and I work from there. So usually about fine-tuning. You should already know what gear ratio is the right one before you even get on the track. And after that, I just change my speedo setting. It's very rare that I have to change the gear ratio on a modified car these days. So another thing is tire prep. Before I start changing my chassis, I will try to figure out the correct tire prep. I mean, these days, most races, they have spec additive, so it's controlled. You can only use one type of additive. But there's still different variables to it. I mean, you can clean the tires before, you can not clean, you can use different temperatures in your tire warmers. You can wipe off the tires certain ways, you can reapply the additive. So all these things are important to figure out before you start working with a car itself, because there's a lot to win or lose from tire prep. And usually you can learn once again from the local guys, or you can try to discuss with your teammates or the other fast guys to see what they're doing, because the tires are extremely important, and most of the time that's where you can win or lose a lot of time even before starting to work on the setup itself. So another thing which I like to decide on before I start fiddling with the setup is the body shell, because the body shell is such a fundamental part of the car that it's good to decide on one body shell and one mounting position before you start working with the setup. So I'll try to stick with the same body shell from early on and then tune the car around there. Because if you change the body shell in the middle of the practice session or in the middle of the race event, if you change to a different body shell type even, I mean, that's a huge change. That's gonna completely change how the car is driving. So usually you'll tune your setup around the body shell, and you don't use the body shell to fine-tune the setup, if that makes sense. I mean, you can change the body shell position, and I made a video about that before, how that affects the handling. But I would rather, again, just stick with the same from early on and then fine-tune the car around there. So a couple runs into the practice, usually you have a good feeling for the track, you're getting consistent, you can start to get a feel for what the car is doing. You can pay attention to how it's handling. So is it understeering, is it oversteering, is it stable, is it nervous initially, those sort of things. So then it's time to start thinking about setup changes. And if I'm at a big race, of course, then it's going to be extremely important what changes to do. But if I'm at a practice session, if I'm even alone at the track, for example, I have a lot of time, I can take it very slowly, I can change just one thing each run and see what it does. And that's how I'd like to work, and that's how I work when I go to the track just for practice, because that makes the most sense. But if you're at a big race, you don't have the time sometimes to change only one thing, or if you're struggling for pace, then you're forced to change more than one thing on the car. So it's something we have to do at a big race, but when I go to the track for testing or for practice, I stick to just one change per run to see what that single thing is doing to the car. So the question is always what to change. If you don't have a clear idea, if you're at a race, you don't have a clear idea in your mind what to change, you can always discuss with your teammates or with your mechanic if you have one to see what the options are. Usually you know from experience that a car that's understeering, usually it will need less towing, for example. And yeah, there's plenty of videos about this and setup information online where you can read more about exactly what to change. But it's always good to have someone to bounce ideas off and to try and decide what's the next thing to do. But of course, if you go to the track alone for testing, it's a great opportunity to learn about a car and what the changes are doing to the car. So the best thing is if you can learn it for yourself, for your own experience, what these things are doing to the car. So you don't have to rely on others as much. You know that, yeah, I went to the track that time, I tested this, and I know exactly what it does for my car and for my driving style. And if this is a good option for me to use for this race and for this particular track. So on-track experience is always the best. Of course, it's good to rely on setup books and those sort of things for reading about setup theory and such. But the best thing is always when you have your own experience and your own feedback from what these things are doing to the car. For example, I don't have a huge technical knowledge. I mean, I'm not an engineer, if that makes sense. I'm a racer. So most of the setup knowledge that I have is from what I've learned on the track from practicing and racing. So learning by doing, basically. And I think that's the best way. It's important to know the theory as well. You don't necessarily have to know all the theory, because sometimes it doesn't apply in the same way as full-scale racing and so on. And sometimes we don't understand why, but the most important thing is learning by doing. That's the moral of the story. Another thing which is very important is to take notes. These days there's very good apps available for your smartphone. I mean, everyone has a smartphone with them, so when you have your phone in your hand, you might as well use an app. Make some notes. You can make a checklist, for example, as I'm going to show you here. I use this app on my phone. It's called Mobile Notes. This way I can write down ideas that I have that I want to test, so that I don't forget things that I had on my mind, and I can write them down and I can make a checklist for when I go practicing or testing. That way it's easier to keep track of things that you're doing to the car. But in addition to that, I also take notes after every major practice session or race. I make more detailed notes, not only about the car, things that I changed on the car, the track, my driving, how the race went, things like that. Basically everything that can be useful for future experiences. So I write all of that down, and that way if I go back to a track or a race in the future, I can look back at my notes and see what I have to remember for the next time to try and improve. And this is immensely important for a professional program at least, and it can even benefit a hobbyist level racing program. So I have a huge database obviously of notes from different races and practice sessions, and I can always go back and look at that history to try and improve for the future. So that's really important in my opinion. It's impossible to keep track of what you're doing just from your memory, especially if you run several classes. If you run more than one class, it's going to be even more difficult. So yeah, that's a really important tip that I would like to suggest. So let's talk about some tire advice and run duration. So when I go practice, for example, I always bring a few sets of tires with me, not just one set. And this applies for both carpet and asphalt. So if I go to the track for a single day of testing, I try to use probably 3 or 4 sets of tires. That way I can get more out of my testing. And why? Because we all know that on asphalt especially, brand new tires are a lot faster. And for 90% of the conditions at least, and they can be significantly faster, so 2 or 3 times per lap even on the first run. And then they usually fall off a little each run, or they fall off to the second run and then they stay the same, or usually that's the pattern that tires follow for asphalt. So you can get around that and you can get more out of your testing, first of all, by using several sets of tires. For example, I would use the 4 sets. I would use 4 runs with brand new tires, and then 4 runs with second run on the tires, and 4 runs with third run on the tires. So if you follow that schedule of running your tires, then you get 4 runs in a row with the exact same age of tires. And that's important because when you're making changes to the car, you will want to have the tires in the same condition to be able to make a fair test. Because if you change something on the car and you run the tires, the same set of tires, then obviously you're gonna lose time from the tires being older. And the other way around, if you put on a fresh set of tires and you change something, you don't know if it was better because obviously the car will have more grip because the tires were newer. So the only way you can really truly test stuff on asphalt is to use several sets of tires and use tires of the same age for a few runs in a row. That way you can more easily determine if the setup change was better. And actually on carpet it's not as critical, but I actually follow this same pattern on carpet. So usually on carpet it's the other way around. The tires get faster as they get older because they get softer, they create more air gap for the insert, and broken in tires are usually faster on carpet. To a certain point, when they can get too old, they get too soft, and they actually slow down. So there you have it again. I mean, if the tires are getting older, they're gonna get faster and then they're gonna slow down. So to be able to have fair testing, you should use several sets and alternate between the sets. That's really good advice that I can give, and I think most people don't follow this kind of pattern for testing, and it can be confusing. So keep that in mind when you're managing your tires. And that's important for another reason as well, to try and simulate the conditions that you're gonna race on. I mean, at big asphalt events, the most important runs that you'll make that will be counted for are runs on new tires normally. So you will want to practice on fresh tires quite often. Just like on carpet, you will not want to run your tires to the ground because you will not be able to run spec tires for that long before racing starts at a big race. So make sure that if you want to race at a big race, practice, try to simulate the race conditions when you practice. The bottom line is you need to invest in tires to get the most out of your practicing and racing. So I always mark my tires like this with a Sharpie. I mark down how many runs they've had. That way you can keep track of how old they are. So keep a Sharpie handy for that. About run duration. When you're testing things on a car, it can be a good thing to actually limit the time of your run. So limit it to 2, 3, even 4 minutes. Don't do the full 5 minutes. And why do I do this? For several reasons. First of all, on asphalt, if you're running on asphalt and you're practicing, as I've just said earlier, tires wear and they get older and they get slower. So by doing that, you can preserve the tires better, and you can use one set of tires for testing more things on the car. So imagine if you go out there with a setup change that was worse and you drive the full 5 minutes, then the tires are basically already ruined. So if you would have only done 2 or 3 minutes for those sessions, you could have tested at least 2 things on the car without destroying the tires. So limit your run duration to preserve the tires for asphalt. That way you can get more out of the same set of tires. The exception is obviously if you're testing electronics. If you're trying to figure out the temperature of your speedo or your motor, then you should do the full 5-minute run for reference. Other than that, I always try to limit my runs to usually 3 or 4 minutes. Unless the car is absolutely terrible, then I try to stop almost immediately because I know there's no point to continue. The other thing is that if you change something on the car and you drive for a longer time, you will adjust your driving for that change. And that's not always good, because then you're actually driving around a problem with the car, and you might actually forget how the car was feeling before that. So when you make a setup change, and if you want to make a fair test, don't drive for too long, just make short runs. However, when it comes to driving practice and getting track time, I recommend getting the full 5-minute runs in, because you will want to simulate the feeling of a run in a race. Then obviously it's 5 minutes. So you will want to try to keep your concentration up for 5 minutes, try to compare your overall time to times from a race, for example. But just for testing, I always try to limit myself to short runs. Also because the longer you run, you heat up your electronics more, your batteries will suffer more, and as I mentioned before, your tires. So it's really easy to actually limit your runs by using the down timer and the alert on the radio. So I'm going to show you on the M17 where that function is. You go into timer and down timer, and you can set this to any value you want, and you can set it to make a noise and to vibrate when the time's up. So that means you'll be alerted when your run is done, and it's really simple and easy to use. Most modern radios have this function, not only the Sanwa radio, but the others as well. So use that function, is really helpful. These are just some general tips that I would like to share, and hopefully they can help you get more out of your practicing and your racing. So I hope that you've enjoyed this, and comment if you have any questions, and send me a message if you don't want to comment. And yeah, good luck with your racing.